Hi everyone. In this lecture, you will learn how to apply OpenAPI documentation to your Elastic Query service. Let's first look at the OpenAPI documentation basics. The OpenAPI specification defines a standard language-agnostic interface to RESTful APIs, which allows both humans and computers to discover and understand capabilities of a service without access to the source code, documentation, or through network traffic inspection. Spring Docs adds the OpenAPI specification to a Spring Boot application using a single dependency, Spring Doc OpenAPI UI. It uses Swagger 3 as the implementation. By including this dependency and using Swagger annotations like operation and API response, you simply automate the generation of API documentation. It supports different formats like JSON, YAML, and HTML. Finally, thanks to Swagger 3 implementation, Spring Docs also supports content negotiation versioning, which is not possible with Swagger 2 version. Alright, let's first add Spring Doc OpenAPI UI dependency by adding the latest version to the POM.xml file. I will use 1.5.0 version. You can run Maven clean install command for the first time to install this dependency. Then let's update the controller methods with Swagger Docs annotations, operation and API response. Operation annotation sets the general description of the method using summary. And API response annotation sets different descriptions and content media type, and also response models schema for different response status codes. For example, for 200 status codes, you set media type using custom vendor media type, and also set response model schema to Elastic Query Service response model here. For 400 and 500 errors, we only set the description. Let's add these annotations to all methods in the controller. As you see, I set the media type as v2 in the API response of getDocument by ID v2 method. I will also add some configuration for ignoring documentation path for the security, and also customizing the API docs and Swagger UI paths. Let's configure web security to allow documentation path without authentication, although you probably want to secure this path also using some kind of authentication. In the config server repository, update config file and add Spring Doc prefix, and set the API docs path as /API-docs, and also set Swagger UI as /swagger-ui.html. You can change these paths using this configuration. Then I will also add a security prefix and add paths to ignore and set this to /API-docs. This will be a string array. I will use this to ignore these paths in the security configuration. Note that I didn't use a wildcard here, so it will only allow API docs path, not for the extension like API docs.yaml. I will set this in a minute. Let's commit and push the changes for the config server before continue. Then I can update the security configuration. I will use value annotation here to obtain the paths to ignore. I will not add this to any configuration class. With the value annotation, you can pick up any config defined in the configuration and use it in the implementation classes. Here I will override another configure method, the one with parameter web security, and add ignoring using ant matchers for the paths to ignore. Alright, let's be sure that Elastic cluster is running and then run the config server. Then I can run the service and check documentation paths. So I will run the Elastic Query service. Let's call the API docs first. As you see, I have the OpenAPI documentation created by Spring Docs. For YAML file, since I didn't use a wildcard in the security paths to ignore configuration, to be able to download, it will ask for a basic authentication password. You can enter user and password that you defined for your configuration using the user config prefix. Finally, let's call Swagger UI HTML from the browser and examine the nice documentation created automatically. I have the controller methods here and also the response types that we have used in our source code, including the Hey to Us link objects. Here I see the media type support, which comes with Swagger 3. I can also call the endpoints and see the responses here. Let's call the getById method for both versions, v1 and v2. As you see, with an incorrect ID, I get a 400 response here. Alright, after adding OpenAPI v3 documentation for our query service, let's containerize this service in the next lecture. So I will see you in the next lecture.